Today we're going to start the module on language. And to begin with, I'd like to give you a working definition. Now, as we know, language can be defined in many ways, but one definition that works well is a set of sounds, a combination of sounds and symbols that are used for communication. So it's essentially a way to get across meaning, to get across thoughts, to get across ideas from one person to another. If I were to ask you how many languages do you think there are in the world today, what would you tell me? 50, 500, 1,000? Now again, this will depend on how a language is defined versus a dialect, but estimates can range anywhere from 3 to 6,000. Now again, that's a big gap, and we're going to explain why that is in a minute. But if it was your goal to learn every single language in the world, that's what you're looking at, anywhere between 3 and 6,000 languages. We discuss language in this class because it is so closely tied with cultural identity. In fact, some say it is the essence of culture. When we think about culture, the words that we use, the way that we say them, is really one of the first things that comes to mind. It really is part of our cultural identity as well as a regional identity. So that's why in many cases it's considered the essence of culture. And many countries are very protective of language and that cultural identity. We can also look at it at a national level and national identity. So this is, again, closely related to mentafacts that we talked about earlier. Now, when we talk about language, we can talk about a standard language and an official language. And actually, I'm going to talk about official language first. An official language is the official language of that country that has been decided upon by the government. So it is the language that is used in schools, it is the language that's used on road signs, in newspapers, on television. It is the chosen unified language for that particular country. Now, in some cases, there may be variations of that particular language. So a standard language is the standardized version of that particular official language. And many times a standardized version of that language is used so that regardless of which region in the country you're from or which regional accent you may have, that you will be able to understand that language, which is why many times if you watch national news, for instance, you'll very rarely hear someone that has a thick accent. In fact, they probably won't have any regional identity at all. In most cases, they'll be using the standard version of that language, and that is so that everyone, no matter where they are from, can understand that particular language. Now, when I gave you that initial number of how many languages there are, and I said there are between 3 and 6,000 languages, you may have asked, well, why is there such a big gap between the number of languages? And I said it has to do with how language is defined. Because in some cases, someone may count a dialect as a separate language. And a dialect is essentially a regional or ethnic difference in the language. And it has to do with vocabulary, with how words are pronounced, with cadence, or a pace of speech. So this particular graphic is showing variations for a common name for soft drinks. And you can see it varies greatly from pop to soda to Coke to pop and soda to Coke and soda to Coke and pop, depending upon where you are in the United States. So they're all talking about the same thing, but they all have regional dialects or a difference in vocabulary for that particular item. If you think about California, you can probably think of certain words that are used in certain regions of California. When I pose this question to the class, can you think of any words that are used in certain regions of California? Many times the word hella comes up as an example. And I'll ask, where exactly is it spoken? And students will give me different answers, and some will say Southern California or Central California, or they'll give certain cities, northern border or southern border. So they might say, oh, the southern border is Bakersfield, or it might be the Grapevine. So they'll have an extent at which the term hella is used. So if we were to draw a line in California around all the places where that particular word is used, that would be called the isogloss. So the isogloss is essentially the boundary within which a particular dialect is spoken. The isogloss is the boundary within which a particular dialect is spoken. Now again, it could have to do with it may do with the actual vocabulary. What word do you use? Do you use pop or soda? It may have to do with how you pronounce something. Do you say tomato? Do you say tomato? Do you say pecan? Do you say pecan? It may have to do with the cadence of your speech. Do you emphasize certain parts of a sentence? Does your voice go up at the end of a sentence? Do you ask, or do you say things in the form of a question? Do you sing things and have a sing-songy tone to how you say things? That's all part of cadence. Or it may have to do with pace of speech, how quickly or how slowly you talk. These are all parts of dialect. So the question becomes, how divergent or how different does a dialect have to become before it is considered a separate language? And that's why we have that number of 3,000 to 6,000 for the numbers of languages, because there might be some people that count all these different dialects as separate languages, and there may be others that clump more together. Now, when we're talking about how languages are formed, there are two primary reasons why they're formed: language divergence and language convergence. Now, we're not going to get into the whole tree of languages. That's more for a linguistics class. But if we look at different ways they're formed based on spatial interaction, divergence and convergence are the two primary ways. And language divergence is essentially when groups of people are separated. And when they're separated, they're then going to have barriers to diffusion of language. And if you have barriers to diffusion in language, those languages over time are going to change. So if you took a group of people and then you divided them up and sent them to 20 different places on the Earth's surface, over time, because of a lack of spatial interaction, the people in those little groups are probably going to have changes in their language over time. Now, this isn't something that happens overnight. This is something that happens over many, many, many years. But that's language divergence, when you have less spatial interaction. Now, in other cases, you have people coming together and more spatial interaction, and that's language convergence. So if you took groups of people from different parts of the world, put them together in the same place, and they all mingled, over a period of time, there might be a sharing of language, a sharing of words, and you might even have a new language being formed out of that. So divergence has to do with less interaction. Convergence has to do with more interaction. Then we can look at how languages diffuse. There are many different ways that language is diffused, but these are the primary ways. One, just human interaction. That's what we've been talking about. You also have print distribution, so brochures, magazines, newspapers, books, migration. Many times when groups of people move, they take their language with them. So this is one of the primary ways that we see languages diffuse, particularly across large spaces because of migration. Trade between people. Many times a new language even has to be invented for this, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. Rise of nation states and a declaration of an official language, and of course, colonialism. So, as former colonial powers such as Britain or France or Belgium took over other territories, they typically brought their language with them. So, it's not uncommon for people that live in places that were formerly colonized to speak more than one language, sometimes their indigenous language and the language of the former colonizer. And in some cases, they might even have an additional language that is referred to as a lingua franca. And a lingua franca is a language that is designated, or in some cases invented, for trade and commerce. So if you have a particular area where many different languages are being spoken, you need to simplify that in order for people to communicate with each other for business. So if we look at East Africa, for instance, where we have dozens and dozens and dozens of different languages being spoken, Swahili is a lingua franca for that particular region. So again, many people in that region can speak not only their indigenous language, but they can speak the lingua franca of Swahili, and they can also speak their official language, which in some cases is Swahili, in other cases it is not. But this was a language that was actually developed particularly for that purpose. So people speaking many different languages could communicate, either people within different tribes or people from different parts of the world. Now, there are a few language families that I want you to be familiar with. If we look at languages of Europe, we have Indo-European languages being the primary language family that is spoken in Europe. And underneath that category, we have Romance languages, Germanic languages, as well as Slavic languages. Now, you don't need to know all the individual locations of all the separate languages, but generally you have an umbrella formation where you have the family, then you have the subfamily, then you have the actual language underneath that. So in the case of a Romance language, would fall under the language family of Indo-European, the subfamily being Romance languages, and then say Italian or French or Spanish being the actual languages underneath that. So I just want you to be familiar with those three primary language subfamilies in Europe. If we look at languages of sub-Saharan Africa, we can see extreme language diversity where literally thousands of languages are spoken. I'd like you to be familiar with the Niger-Congo family, which is the orange color, which extends all the way from East Africa to Southern Africa. And this is the most widely spoken language family. Again, it is comprised of several subfamilies, but just focus on the actual families. The Niger-Congo family, sometimes referred to as the Niger-Kordofanian family. I also would like you to be familiar with this Khoisan family in the southern portion, and this is the teal color, and this is the oldest language family spoken in Africa. But also we have the effects of colonialism on language. Here it's just showing Indo-European languages being spoken in the southern portion of Africa, but actually, as I mentioned, all throughout Africa where there was a colonial presence, we can find Indo-European languages. So as I said, many can speak languages of the colonizer plus indigenous languages and official language.